interesting. So welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to introduce Michael Simeone, especially since I don't think I have to introduce him really because everybody knows him. Michael is our resident data scientist and data analytics expert, who we are just in the process of stealing away from the library and moving him to SCAS and GFL to basically build up a whole data science and analytics unit in our domain. And since he has collaborated with pretty much everybody on this call already, you see the logic for this. Michael is an interesting guy because his original training was in English, which according to Sheldon Glashow, physics Nobel laureate, is in the domain called the humanoids. But he then made a transition to do some really interesting computational, analytical, and data science things. And I think I have met him on the day he arrived at ASU at the reception, and we have been working together ever since. And so without further ado, he will inform us about misinformation landscapes, which is a rather poetic title for a somewhat dirty subject.
Yeah, thanks, Manfred. So hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for making time on your Friday morning to chat a little bit about misinformation. It's a little humbling as we all talk about our abilities to be in multiple Zooms at once at the beginning of a presentation that I'm giving. And so if you're dividing your attention, I still appreciate that you're here. Would I be able to have screen sharing?
You should. Who owns this?
Oh, we're doing great. Okay, so, I started off thinking about misinformation and complexity, not because, what we're not going to do today is say we should think about misinformation as a complex system because it has interdependence and scaling and so on and so forth, and then we'll roll the credits. Instead, I want to think about specific ideas from complexity motivating a theory that helps transform how we think oftentimes about misinformation, namely how misinformation spreads, what misinformation is, and what the overall problem is when it comes to misinformation. And one of the things that I'm going to keep coming back to is this idea that misinformation is some kind of contaminant, or that misinformation is a virus, or that misinformation is an attack or a weapon. And that what we need as end users is inoculation, armor, or literacy, or we just don't want to get infected. And so these epidemiological metaphors, whether or not they are kind of directly epidemiological, or sometimes they might be ecological, to suggest that misinformation is pollution, and that we want to keep people away from this bad substance that's just going to have a contaminating effect. This is the discourse that I'm responding to. And I want to find a better way, or I don't want to say better. I want to find something that calls attention to things that are currently not focalized by this sender-receiver idea of misinformation and misinformation transition. And we'll see that there's, a lot of things that are kind of under thought through in that model. But as Manfred mentioned, I used to be an English major, and then I liked English so much that not only was I an English major, but I also decided to get a master's in English and then decided to get a PhD in English too. And so there are going to be certain things methodologically, right? Like Lewontin says, right? You only get one set of disciplinary DNA. And so I'm just going to cop to this right away that even though I do data science and analytics, I do natural language processing, I do social media analysis, my disciplinary origins are in English and English literature. But what this means is something that the humanities deeply care about, but something that is astonishing in how little it matters in a lot of misinformation research is the idea of interpretation, or that readers are the site of important interpretive acts. And that so often we treat audiences like they are informational relays, or like as Murawski would describe these kinds of the cyborg economics, right? Just the idea that people, while they might not be rational actors, are merely conduits for information spreading around. And so in the humanities, one of the things that I want to import from the humanities into this conversation is that interpretation is a complicated, overdetermined process that is still very meaningful, and it's often elided when we think about disease models of misinformation. So people interpret what they read, even if that interpretation can be predictable. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's just purely mechanistic and linear. So why am I going to complexity here to think about misinformation? Well, there's three different areas that I think are going to be really helpful as we start to cultivate this idea of a misinformation landscape. One is this idea that I spoke about just now, which is language and interpretation. Interpretation is a complicated process. It is, at least in the theory, in cultural theory, it is dependent on a number of different factors. It's not just reducible to cognitive bias or confirmation bias. I want to think about vulnerability, which is something that we don't often think about. We sometimes conceptualize vulnerability as weakness, but vulnerability is more than just a weakness or a flaw. And so I want to recast vulnerability as a site of activity wherein misinformation works. And I use that word very deliberately because I think misinformation works as in it might deceive somebody or mislead them, but I also want to put out there that misinformation works in the sense that misinformation has a use. We are not just duping or infecting people. This is political influence, and there is an interest in using the explanatory value of misinformation when misinformation is adopted and spread. And then I want to get to this idea of a fitness landscape, right? So I want to avoid ecological metaphors about misinformation where I can, because I don't want to think about misinformation as pollution in an otherwise pristine environment that used to be just fine before we started dumping misinformation into it. I want to think about, from an evolutionary dynamics perspective, this idea of a fitness landscape. And I want to think about the spread or reproduction of misinformation as fitness within niches that are adapted to, rather than think about how virulent the poison is as being, or how clever the lie is, or this kind of Cambridge Analytica myth about if it's just incredibly targeted and incredibly deceptive and smartly rolled out, then anyone can be seduced, right? I want to get away from that perspective where we just focus on the content. I want to think about vulnerability and interpretation on balance or in perspective with an overall landscape of possibilities that characterizes misinformation and the activity of misinformation. So that's what I'm getting at when I say a misinformation landscape. It is a play on words with a fitness landscape, but it is also meant to be encompassing of a number of different factors that aren't considered a lot of times in scholarship on misinformation, or things that I would like to especially emphasize in our own work here on misinformation. So I want to talk about this slide just in terms of terminology. I am just going to use the term misinformation as an umbrella term for all different kinds of mis, dis, and malinformation. One of the ways that we often encounter the idea of misinformation is this concept of fake news, right? And a lot of the early work kind of in response to, I say early, but 2014, 2015, and 2016 kind of leading up to and in response to the 2016 presidential election, a lot of the language, particularly on the epistemology of misinformation, tends to swirl around the idea of fake news, right? This is it feels like there's consensus around what this means. And oftentimes when we talk about misinformation or disinformation, we get funneled toward conversations about fake news. And that's not to say that that's not a useful thing to do, but I just want to call it out that this is something that we often deal with. But that fake news, my perspective is that fake news is a developmental category rather than a definitive one when we're thinking about misinformation. Namely, fake news or misinformation or disinformation parodying the genre of news, right? That might not always stick around. So misinformation or disinformation and fake news aren't the same thing. And even, some of right now with the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's state media is actually publishing fact checks on true facts to deceive people like, no, this building was not actually bombed. We're fact checking this, right? So that's not news. It's not fake news, but it shows again that misinformation is using another genre as a way to deceive or misinform. Okay, so fake news is a kind of historical concept. It might not be a permanent one. I'm also in this talk, I'm going to assume that the rules for misinformation or the propagation of misinformation are different from other kinds of information, namely that misinformation or the propagation of untrue information behaves differently than the propagation of true information, right? So what we're not saying today is misinformation behaves just like other information and it's all information and there's no truth and no falsehood. Right. At the same time, I want to say that there's something more at stake in the distinction between misinformation and truth than just is it true or is it false? Right. So the game for misinformation to stay alive, if you will, is different than the game for truthful information to stay alive. And again, just to emphasize that people interpret information, they do not merely relay information that they are given, even if that interpretation is a split second where it feels like this person is behaving like a bot. There was some kind of interpretation happening, and I don't want to undercut that, right? We're not just talking about information relays. We're not talking about people who are going to behave just like a cell and just pass on a virus. Okay. And I'm going to try to keep up with the chat here. And I might just have to get to the chat at the end, but I really appreciate that comment. So one of the things that I want to flip around a little bit is, again, we often get into this idea of the Cambridge Analytica or myth, or just this idea that Putin is playing 5-dimensional chess with the United States and that these incredibly expert hackers and misinformation operations are able to just play the strings of the American public, and these are precision attacks on people, and that we just need to pay attention to the content. And if we can only understand that the content is wrong, then we'll be better off for it. And I don't want to take that position. I understand that sometimes one would want to take a very forensic approach to the content. Where did it come from? Who made it? What was their intention? But one of the contributions of post-structuralism in the humanities is that the author is dead. No one cares about who wrote it or why they did it. What we care about is the effect. We care about the surface of interaction between those messages and the audience. And that's the emphasis that I want to bring today. So again, I am not undercutting the need or even the value to do this kind of work where we really want to understand the content and what people are trying to say and what their motivations might be and what they're trying to accomplish. Obviously, very important stuff. However, today, I really want us to think about the audiences and how much of a participation they have in this overall landscape. All right. We oftentimes think about misinformation as something that only happens to uneducated people. Anybody want to point out for me what's wrong with this picture? How many people wake up in the morning and get a hot cup of coffee and sit down in their favorite chair and read the New York Times Post? Probably no one, but you wouldn't know because it really looks a lot like the New York Times or the Washington Post or some kind of spin-off publication. This publication is actually shared, like I've seen faculty at ASU share links from this publication under the impression that it is some kind of legitimate news outlet. Now, why does this exist? Is its job to spread information? Is this owned by some kind of government-run intelligence agency? We don't know. Or is its job just to generate clicks and make ad money? We don't know. Maybe we could find out. To me, it doesn't matter. Or today, it doesn't matter. What matters is it's just misinforming content. This is one of those publications that really played up the idea that, you know, kids on TikTok were the ones that hacked a Trump rally and kept people from showing up back in 2020. It turned out that that was really an exaggeration, but it was a great story, right? And people on the political left absolutely loved it. This website ran that story, and a ton of people shared that link all over Facebook, including faculty at ASU. It's not about your educational attainment. or even how savvy you are to, know what's what. If you have a need or a desire, if you have politics, then you are vulnerable to misinformation. What you want is what you see. And again, it's not just about cognitive bias. Politics is about negotiating for material and political positions. We aren't merely observing people operating under confirmation bias, right? There's a lot of stuff at stake in 2020 when people are sharing these kinds of links. They're not just fastly trying to confirm their political position. Those political positions mean stuff in the real world outside of Twitter. It's calling attention to something like Breitbart, which could be considered misinformation, but calling attention here to how editorial decisions can create an experience for an audience that can be misleading, even if it's not outright false. A lot of times when it comes to misinformation or kind of the downstream effects of misinformation, we really get hung up on truth or falsehood. But this kind of content can have a kind of corrosive effect on what counts as information that matters. And it can also get us in a position where the way that we consume information transforms from reasoning through stuff to just clicking on stuff that's appealing. Again, that is not merely a psychological bias. And it's something that I want to, again, emphasize today. Misinformation isn't as important as, say, the misinforming effect. Right. So we're going to see here an example in a second where you can still have the effect of misinformation without any lies at all. So we have some questions about what makes news fake, what makes information bad, what is good information. All of these things are kind of have normative claims built into them. And I guess I'm fine with that. But all of this oftentimes leads up to this very positivist position towards information literacy or media literacy. And while I don't want to underplay the role of this kind of training in how important it is for us to be able to manage these kinds of situations in the future, what we don't want to do is get into a position where we just need to train people to tell the difference between fact and fiction when they're encountering this stuff. And if we just diagnose the content, then we're going to be okay. Because sometimes truth or falsehood isn't what's at stake in creating the kind of chaos or division or confusion that misinformation oftentimes creates. And so sometimes we can use mostly true stuff to confuse and divide people. We don't need to tell outright lies. And so training people to be positivists to say, well, I know this is true and this is false and I'm done, right? That's, if we get an overly positivist approach to information literacy, then we're going to go wrong. And here's an example, right? I want to talk about vulnerability, right? So oftentimes we think about vulnerability as a flaw or a weakness. Somebody has low educational attainment. They might have, they might not be as intelligent or emotionally mature, right? These are the kinds of things that people posit as ways to describe if someone might be vulnerable to misinformation. And so we can often think that people who are highly educated or very intelligent or manage their cognitive biases, whatever that means anymore, are somehow immune to misinformation. Or if people have gone through misinformation training, then they can cultivate some kind of immunity, right? Even conversations about having a vaccine for misinformation, right? Where that gravely oversimplifies what it means to be vulnerable to misinformation. In the example that we just talked about the Washington Times Post, about somebody clicking on a link or even sharing a link because it validated a position. It provided explanatory value for something that they observed. And it moved along their politics, right? It boosted their side, right? Boosting your side politically in an effort to kind of regain what you think is your voice in the national conversation in a very kind of riven time and a crisis-filled time, that is not just a cognitive bias, right? These are interpretive moves and these are desires and needs of the consumers. And so the idea that you're vulnerable because you're weak is something that I want to get rid of, right? The idea that you have needs, motivations, or vested interests is what makes you vulnerable to misinformation, right? Or is what makes, these are all niches for misinformation to adapt to, either on purpose or accidentally. We see this a lot with something like a fake news detector, right? So this is just a kind of what I would call a representative way that we oftentimes go into a fake news diagnostic system, which is we are going to compare material that we see against a database of facts. We're going to go out and find some high profile materials, and then we're going to determine if they're telling truth from falsehood. Now, this is an invaluable tool and it's really great work. But this is why I'm talking about what I'm talking about is a lot of the models and a lot of the kind of operationalized procedures for understanding misinformation are trying to diagnose stuff that's outright false, with the assumption that if we just know what's wrong, we'll be okay, right? Or the truth, if we distribute enough, can save us, right? But there's a kind of emerging literature that suggests that fact checking only has really limited powers, right? And so fake news detectors are limited by however far reaching fact checking can be, because oftentimes people are not interested in facts, or they do not trust the authorities that validate those facts. And so if you have someone who has low institutional trust for whatever reason, then fact checking isn't going to work for them. They don't even trust the institutions that put out facts, right? My colleague, Christy Roschke, in her work on kind of post-colonial information literacy, right? One of the points that she makes is showing up somewhere and just saying, you should just trust your public institutions. They're the ones with all the information, right? You're assuming a lot about public institutions. And it's certainly not fair. And you certainly shouldn't make it a pillar of your work to assume that public institutions are trustworthy. And so if we walk in and we decide that we want to start fact checking and no one trusts the authorities creating the facts, well, we've got a really good system. We might have a good system from a technical point of view, but in terms of the impact, it's going to be very limited. In other words, right, I'm interested in understanding the socket, not just the wires. So vulnerability is a way of understanding a lot of the different interdependent factors that go into somebody needing to believe that something is true. And that could be political expediency. It could be a cognitive bias. It could be whatever affective kind of state that person is in. It could also be a vested political interest or explanatory value, right? A lot of times when people talk about conspiracy theories, we like to talk about all kinds of other misinformation as well, not just conspiracy theories. It explains something that is otherwise very technical and complex. When we think about the distribution of misinformation around COVID-19, it's actually a very complicated concept, but the ways that misinformation oftentimes succeeds is to provide an explanatory framework where other public institutions have not been able to be as successful. And so this saying that my colleagues and I have of misinformation loves a vacuum, right? If we don't have a good explanation for something that's out there and trusted and well circulated, it's a great opportunity for misinformation to spread. And that's not because everybody who believes it is wrong. It's just because it fits with the way that they explain things or provides a handy explanation, right? One of the most interesting things in my own experience is, recovering from surgery during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the kind of physical therapists or other highly trained and intelligent medical professionals that you encounter in rehab, I would say 70% of them will not get the vaccine and do not care about masks. These are highly educated people that I trust with my life and livelihood. They don't trust the vaccine. They are not unintelligent. They are not uneducated. It's not like they don't have expertise, but their configuration of what is explanatory for them, what institutions they trust, and where they get their media are different than mine. So it's not just that they're vulnerable or that they're weak. They have a series of different interdependent contingencies here at play for them. And that's why they make the decisions that they make. So I want vulnerability to be more complicated than we're used to thinking about it. So this conventional framework, right? We think about propagation, literacy, the systemic problems of misinformation, and the burden of responsibility. There's a conventional framework that these are the kind of 4-point summary of a lot of the stuff we've been building up to for now. And then I want to think about this idea of value and vulnerability, which is also the name of a paper under review by myself and my colleagues, Sean Walker at ASU West and Christy Roschke with Cronkite School for Journalism and Mass Communication, right? So in this idea, right, assuming that we find value and use, that misinformation works for the audience. That we adopt this stuff because it's handy, not it infects us because we are weak. It's also humbling, right? That information has a value to people outside of its truthfulness, right? We can assume that the most valuable thing information can do is be true. But misinformation is valuable to people far beyond its truthfulness. The idea that misinformation is a disease, right? That we're somehow in a world that's just toxic and polluted. Misinformation is a symptom, right? Half of the stuff that gets sent around doesn't succeed in the way that it does if we're not already a very politically divided country, if we don't already have a massive income inequality, if we're not in the process of an unprecedented redistribution of wealth to the top percentage, right? That is a systemic condition that exists well outside social media, right? To go back and say, oh, all this misinformation is a disease and we're just contaminated with all this wrong stuff. I mean, okay, but the reason it's allowed to succeed is some of these other divisions that exist prior to the messages that we observe on social media. We don't want to think about political polarization as merely an outcome of misinformation. Political polarization is the prerequisite to being misinformed. And so I want to combine this idea of messages, of receivers of interpretation, and I want to roll all that together into thinking about this landscape, right? Of a distribution of messages, and some get to reproduce and some do not. Some achieve fitness and some do not. And the reasons for that fitness are dovetail with the vulnerability that we just talked about, okay? And the use and value of misinformation. So this idea of a misinformation landscape, again, borrowing from the idea of a fitness landscape in an evolution, right, which is which information is allowed to reproduce. And then there's a vested interest in reproducing thoughts and political position that is far beyond confirmation bias, right? That as political actors, however far down into the liberal arts side of the quad we want to get, right? We could get all the way into biopolitics with Foucault if we want, or we could just go into, say, like vested interest theory with Brad Adame at our own ASU, right? But the idea that we want to reproduce a political position, that audiences are political actors, and all of them together, right? We could even consider as part of a multi-level network, right? We have nodes with lots of different interdependent contingencies that characterize their vulnerability, and those nodes are linked together in a kind of landscape, and then existing in that landscape as well as a number of different cultural, political, and historical factors. All of that comprises this landscape. I want to talk about the Oroville Dam back in 2017 in February, when these kind of freak rains flooded the Upper Feather River. The Oroville Dam infrastructure itself was stressed to the point of near failure. I'm talking about this because it kind of picks up on where we were talking about before about a misinforming effect. And that rather than thinking about just truth or falsehood. So one thing that happened is kind of right as things were reaching their crisis point, RT.com, which is the kind of sanitized face for American media for Russia Today, which is state-sponsored media. It is for those who know it, right, you know it as a kind of purpose-built, charismatic outlet designed to communicate a lot with Western audiences. They have an English-speaking website. They have English-speaking video content that they produce. So hosted on Ruptly, which is their video hosting platform, and tweeted out by RT.com on Twitter, was a drone footage of the dam infrastructure under duress, right? Water gushing everywhere. No outright lies being told in this video. In fact, you can't really determine any particular deception, but boy, did it touch off a controversy on Twitter for those who were following or conversing about Oroville Dam. And we collected data and observed this kind of controversy. And you had people on the political left and the political right, environmental rights activists and kind of notorious right-wing shit stirrers, both arguing with one another about what this video meant. Was it a harbinger for climate change? Or was it evidence that funding from the Democrats in California had been squandered on illegal immigrants, and therefore there was no more money left for critical infrastructure? Both sides saw it in a different way. It was refracted through the prism of their political motivations and their contingencies as kind of actors, but nothing in that video was outright false. Now, we can't see the video now because has since been taken down, okay? And RT, I don't know if RT is even available on the internet right now, but fortunately we have Facebook. Facebook, just in the way that it kind of archives material, kept a copy of this particular video, and I'm going to try to see if we can watch it right now. So if you'll bear with me while I change my screen share, I think it's important that we just get a peek at this because it really spells out why we don't need to lie to have a misinforming effect. Sometimes all we need to do is accelerate a process that already exists. If people are already good at misinforming themselves because they're politically driven, then perhaps all we need to do is accelerate the system rather than tell a lie. And so we can misinform by just accelerating a process that already exists. So here we are. You can't hear the sound. In film theory, they say that your experience is 60% sound. I'm sorry that you don't get to hear that. You might get to pick it up if I turn it up. Can everyone hear the ominous music? Okay, great. All right. So here we are. The problem had been diagnosed 12 years ago. It was indeed a very large and significant dam. Nothing on the text itself was explicitly wrong. Yet, it succeeds in doing a couple things. And can everyone see this okay now? We're back to the slide. It does a great job of insinuating a certain kind of American decline without coming out and saying it. But this video was one of the most influential videos of the entire conversation. Right here is a key agents based on a number of on a cocktail of centrality measures that we did on the Twitter network after we removed mentions, where folks like CNN and Donald Trump and the governor of California were all kind of accepted from this, and we're just looking at who's interacted with whom. Here is a kind of right-wing partisan. Here is Russia Today. Here is right-wing partisan environmental advocate, right-wing partisan FEMA. All right, so one of the most influential domains here is Russia Today. They're narrating this, and people are playing off of this in a way that reinforces their political positions. But Russia Today didn't have to lie in order to create this effect. All they had to do was create something that was charismatic and that sparked discussion. Because the assumption is that by sparking that discussion, people are just going to continue a misinforming procedure for how they interpret things, rather than just rely on something that is outright false, right? So misinformation can occur at the interpretive level, right? You can take perfectly good content and then process it in a misinforming way, and then the outcome downstream has the same effect as if we had told a great big lie and deceived a whole bunch of people because we're just so brilliant in the kinds of lies that we can tell. Interpretation, again, is something that I want to call attention to, right? So you can have a misinforming effect or a misinforming epistemology, right? That misinformation can start at epistemology rather than start at the truth or falsehood of the content itself. This is a reference to a paper that my colleagues and I published last year. Basically, how can we describe misinformation outside of just truth or falsehood? And this is called the MPED model for information quality. And it tries to understand the kind of linguistic, tonal, and kind of ephemerality dimensions of misinformation. How long does that account stay up? How long does the linked content stay up? Is the post deleted? What's the kind of lexical diversity of the information? And then what is the certainty communicated or as we can extract, right? Based by the usage of verbs, right? One of the things that we found in our own work is that misinformation tends to be more certain and doesn't tend to use certain subjunctive and conditional language as, say, quote unquote, true news or true information, right? Certainty is appealing, right? And this goes back to this idea of what makes someone vulnerable is a need for some kind of explanation or a need for certainty. Misinformation loves a vacuum. Certainty is like catnip when it comes to getting misinformation to succeed, right? And so we try to create a 5-point model where we can evaluate what's going on rather than just categorize it as true or false. And all of this is with an eye towards trying to understand what that misinformation is doing and what kinds of interpretive strategies people have available to them or not, right? If you delete something right after you post it, you don't have the capability to go back and evaluate it. Let's talk for a minute about the January 6th Capitol invasion. My colleague Sean Walker and I got to contribute to a report published by the New America Foundation. It had been a year's worth of work of evaluating the decommissioned Parler platform and what its role was in the lead up to the January 6th insurrection. One of the things that we can observe in Parler is that while it existed for around 2 years, it kind of had 6 months of really rampant and ramped up activity around these discourses that Parler was an alternative to quote unquote big tech, right? Parler is kind of the locus classicus for alt tech, or what the team that I'm working with calls alt tech. Things like Getter, Gab, Give, Send, Go rather than GoFundMe. A whole other alternative kind of infrastructure or set of social media apps and platforms that are, supposedly for patriots and support free speech. Instead, they're very interesting environments for misinformation to adapt and to propagate. Here's some stuff from the Stanford Internet Observatory, just to show that this stuff that membership on Parler explodes over time, and it works very well as an outlet or a venue for prominent right-wing media figures. And that's important to think through for the following reason, right? Is that Parler is a way to metabolize certain parts of the right-wing media that Twitter might not succeed at, right? Or that Facebook might not succeed at, or can additionally succeed. And it provides additional niches for this kind of stuff to exist. And I want to call particular attention to the influencer data set that we analyzed in Parler, where we're trying to look at some of the 100 or so most influential accounts on Parler as kind of identified and curated by the misinformation researcher David Troy. And we did a kind of short text topic model to try to understand what some of these influencers were talking about most prominently. And it's at this point where I think it's important to understand that in these topics, right, it's hard to look at these topic descriptions and get a sense of exactly what's going on. But what you can see a ton of already is recruiting for white supremacist organizations, allegations of election fraud, discussions about Portland and the civic order falling apart because BLM is given a free pass to assault the police, Trump's opposition to the election and that it's fake, and then conversations about Joe Biden being a false president or somebody who's stealing the election away. When we map this out with just a really simple kind of network presentation of which topics kind of overlap on certain ideas, We could spend a little time with this, and we write this up in our report on the New America Foundation website. What you see in Parler is existential crisis. Okay? That the idea that the election is being stolen, the idea that this virus is a hoax trying to destabilize the economy, the idea that Biden has stolen the election, the idea that the police are being undermined at every corner and that BLM and Antifa are coming for your wife and kids. This is the picture painted by the influencers on Parler. This is a threat to people's way of life, to create this kind of existential threat. So when we ask the question, how did we get there? How did we get to January 6th from Parler, right? The answer is, we don't necessarily need, it's not about lying to people. It's not about just wrong stuff. It's about creating the overall idea that the world is ending or that your way of life is ending, right? Misinformation is ultimately about political influence, right? And this worked very well for this particular audience. And so it's not about one specific lie, right? Although the election theft was a very important one, right? It was of a piece of a much larger theme of mistrusting institutions, or kind of longstanding public institutions in the United States, from elections to the CDC. And so what we can see in something like this, right, is an environment where misinformation is going to succeed because people already believe that they are in an existential crisis, right? Or if they're convinced of an existential crisis, their needs and contingencies as audiences become very different. They think their way of life is ending, right? Which, when you look into like the literature of peace psychology, if you threaten someone's way of life or someone feels like their way of life could be ending, oftentimes people can interpret that as an end of their life, right? Or they experience that as an existential threat. And so if you've got people who are convinced that their way of life is ending, then they will respond to certain messages that other people will not. That doesn't make them weak or stupid. Okay? It just means that they think their way of life is ending. And I'm not apologizing for bad behavior or some of the like outright evil things that are going on, but I'm trying to call attention to the fact that it's more than just truth or falsehood. A fake news detector is not going to bail us out of a situation where people are convinced that their way of life is ending because of a lot of other political and cultural circumstances, not just lies or fake news that they read on Twitter. And so where do we go from here when we think about fitness landscapes and we want to think about audiences and interpretation with kind of renewed interest, right? So one thing that I'm interested in is what interdependent factors create vulnerability and to what messages, right? A lot of times we treat, in some of our models, we treat misinformation as not having any real semantic value, right? We'll just model it as just a particle that goes into somebody and then might get transmitted out at a certain probability. But semantics matter, right? The political left responds to messages that the political right does not. Multi-level networks, as I kind of indicated earlier, is one proposed approach for thinking through this. And then just to renew this idea that misinformation is about interpretation and not necessarily all about content, right? And that interpretive act is overdetermined. And so you can encounter true information and still have that downstream misinforming effect. And so thinking about epistemology rather than cognitive bias is a growth area for the way we think about misinformation and how we can think about this overall landscape where misinformation can achieve fitness and influence, or where the net effect is a misinforming influence. And then the other thing is, what are the best practices for intervention? Training in information literacy is obviously something that works in some ways, but do we need training for journalists? Right, because there are certain misinformation events that happen because someone in the press will pick up on something and publish it, and then that validates a position that didn't actually exist in the first place. For instance, there was back when there were wildfires a couple of years ago in the Pacific Northwest, a local paper had published some information about it's possible that Antifa, that basically not only were right-wing partisans spreading misinformation about Antifa starting the fires, but on the left, people were spreading rumors about the Proud Boys starting the fires. And we did our best to try to find where on social media that rumor came from, and we could not find it. We worked with Steve Corman, also at ASU, and did an investigate. We couldn't find anything. And to the best of our ability, the origin of that story came from a local paper. So we don't know where it was sourced, but where it started to gain attention and traction started with a local paper. And so sometimes training for journalists, right, might be a way to intervene here too, because we're starting to understand how this stuff, what niches misinformation occupies, or what its origin points are outside of just purely nefarious motivations. And the main thing that I want us to think about is that misinformation, not on purpose, but misinformation achieves a certain adaptive fitness. And that adaptive fitness occurs not just on a population of rubes, okay, but a complex landscape of human beings who have a lot of different political and social contingencies and who are making these kinds of interpretive transactions day in and day out. And so with that, I just want to thank my collaborators who have just been terrific. These are collaborators on papers or have been, really wonderful partners in conversation, and are members of the GSI Misinformation Working Group who have contributed to some of these conversations as well. And so a big thank you to folks that have entertained some of these ideas in the past and have also been collaborators on these projects. And I'll just end on this slide where we've got some upcoming work in this speaker series. So thanks very much for your time today, and I'll just turn it over for a few minutes where we can talk, and I'll also commit to reading through the chat.
Well, thanks, Michael, for this extremely stimulating and provocative talk about a topic I think that every one of us is confronted on a daily basis. So I open the floor for discussions. There are some interesting ones in the chat about mainly focusing on the niche construction dimension of information and misinformation. So if you want to start with those, or anybody else who wants to jump in.
Yeah, this question, Ted, that you raised, the cultural evolution of vulnerability, is a really interesting question. I think it would be hard not to at least intersect with some of the post-Marxist theory about ideology, and thinking through what people's imagined conditions are to their real circumstances, right? I think there's a whole gob of theory there that we would at least contend with. Although asking that question, I think in the kind of empirical way that you're posing it, it would be interesting to investigate that. So I appreciate that feedback, and I appreciate the posing of that question.
Well, I just for context, and I think this is commented from Michael and Stephanie and me earlier in the chats, is that I wonder if there's an intersection between the kind of information niches framework that you have here and the frameworks that you were kind of rejecting at the beginning through kind of a niche construction feedback idea. So, I mean, it is. I think you raise a great point that there's niches that attract certain kind of memes to kind of sit in them, and there's going to be a coexistence of them, like in a kind of a community ecology of information. But information also can have a plastic deformation on people and can strengthen those niches or create new niches. And so, is it really an either or?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think I appreciate you bringing that up. My goal here is to call attention to something that we're just not paying attention to, but is not to just stomp out that other form of thinking, right? So rhetorically, I'm trying to cast a lot of light on this other way of thinking about it. But yeah, I take your point to heart. The idea is not that some of these papers are wrong just because they use the wrong metaphor. That's not what I'm saying. So yeah, this point, I like it. Thank you.
If I can follow up on that, I think there's an interesting parallel in the way we conceptualize causality in complex systems. So for a long time, biologists were searching for a gene for something. And within a certain paradigm, they were remotely successful because they picked the low-hanging fruit. But what that led basically to an atomization of what biological systems are. So they are composed of certain units, in this case, informational units like genes. But what we are seeing, the more we learn about how those systems actually function, is that it is all in the dynamic interactions of those units. And that includes constructed niches at various scales. So I think the problem that we have, that we are in a similar way, is that we are trying to find a unit of information or misinformation. But as you have pointed out, it's all about the interpretation and the context. So in that sense, we have to understand the dynamics of the overall system in order to then assess fitness components of information or misinformation, and can try to pin it down to some individualized units. I think Ken has something to say about this because he is thinking in similar terms about genes.
Yeah, no, exactly. So actually, you jumped me to the comment that I was going to make, because I think that there's I think this gene metaphor is actually quite powerful in this space if we don't embrace the traditional reductionist view of evolution, if we don't embrace if we actually recognize that gene fitness is a product of the context in which it finds itself in. And at the end of the day, no gene has absolute fitness. Its fitness is determined by where it resides, in what environment, in what other genomic context, so what other means it would live with, as well as what other environmental context it finds itself. And fitness is 1000% relative. And I think actually, ironically, and maybe to be controversial, I never know if I can say these things out loud, but there's a danger with the current strategy of what the eugenicists thought they would do with genetics a century ago, is all we needed to do is eliminate the bad genes and we'd have a perfect society. And in this instance, I worry that the current strategy with respect to misinformation isn't embracing the context and recognizing the complexity of what might have to be done. So I just think this, and I'd be interested in further discussion and exploration of how to use this next generation thinking, evolutionary thinking around the development, of what misinformation is, because it's misinformation based on a certain context. And as you implied in other things, that powerful misinformation oftentimes has facts tied to it. It's not just wrong. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't wrong stuff. I'm just thinking about the current stuff that the Ukraine is doing, or that the Russians are doing with respect to the Ukraine, and labeling them as Nazis. And it's the reason that has tractions in Russia and Ukraine has to do with the emergence of right-wing groups that have been being embraced, and so it has an echo of truth. It has a funhouse view of truth. So context becomes really, really important when you start to try to stamp these things out. So way cool.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I certainly have a vested interest in working with colleagues in SCAS around the kind of evolutionary dynamics of misinformation. So yeah, this talk is also an invitation. Yeah, Shade.
You hear me okay? You said something early in on your talk that I never heard you follow up on or justify, and that was that misinformation and good information have fundamental different ways of, I forget the exact term, basically fighting for survival or propagating themselves.
Yeah, I think I wanted to put that out there as my assumption, as documenting an assumption that I was proceeding from, that misinformation has a different game than true information. I could be wrong. It may end up that we discover that information and misinformation are all just information and it's all swirling around the same toilet bowl and there we are. But I think that if someone is processing information as a way to get to truth or approximate truth, then that is going to be a different procedure than somebody who's circulating or adopting misinformation in a way to not pursue those things. So it's more about how we metabolize that information. Sorry, I don't want to get all metaphorical, right? But what are procedures for interpreting that information more than anything else, right? You can actually have a misinforming procedure on true information, right? I can read something, I can see a headline and think it kicks ass and then share it immediately. And that is still a misinforming way of processing information, even if that information itself is true. And so, how we get into documenting the exact ways that misinformation, the rule sets for misinformation versus information, right? That's tentative. That's something I have a pin in right now, and I don't pretend to have sorted out completely. But it was just an assumption that I'm laying out today, that there is not just a kind of ontological distinction between true and false information, but that there is a mechanical distinction in the way that these two different kinds of information circulate around. And this is just drawn from what I've read from or gathered from psychologists and neuroscientists and stuff like that, but admittedly scratching the surface relative to other expertise. But yeah, that's where that is. Thank you for pressing on that.
Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, I'm a student with the School of Sustainability and Masters of Science, and I'm really trying to focus on kind of these topics as it applies to sustainable decision making for our futures. And I was curious about where some of this fits in with ASU and work being conducted. And I know there's the Nexus Lab and there's the project that's extended from it in regards to these topics. I'm interested in the transdisciplinary nature of the approach to some of these problems. And if we're bringing in other people from other fields, for an example, like a paper was just published by Eileen McConnell in the the School of Transborder Studies about mental models and inflated numbers and interpretation of immigration and how that relates to support for border wall policies and things like that. And I'm just curious if like ASU is working to kind of be a little bit transdisciplinary in their approach to these elements, because there's a lot being done, it seems like, in a lot of places. And I've been trying to like nail some down and try and figure out how to get in those spaces and kind of what this work is going to look like moving forward at ASU.
Yeah, so I think I owe you an email, but we should talk. One thing that I'll say is that yes, and the kind of Oroville Dam study is a paper that we've been working on for a while and just haven't gotten it out the door. The main takeaway, at least as we wind down the clock, is misinformation also ruins our subsequent adaptive capacity, right? We like to talk about resilience in ways that we can anticipate and respond, but narratives have a way of muddying our future adaptive responses, right? If I push the narrative that it's actually the fault of illegal immigrants from Mexico, and that's why we don't have roads, bridges, and dams. Well, people's ability to cooperate to solve that problem in the future is going to be like mitigated by the fact that they just can't line up as to why we're here in the first place. We don't understand the root cause. And so cooperating to kind of get to or overcome some of the greatest challenges people are ever going to face is going to be much more difficult, because there is a kind of corrosive effect that misinformation can have on our adaptive capacity. And so for me, there is a informational and a narrative component to eroding that adaptive capacity. So that's the kind of shtick. What you're saying seems to be of a piece of that overall idea. But I think, to me, just really quickly, that's where the rubber meets the road on resilience studies and misinformation, or one of them. So.
Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. Of course, we could go on forever. So, and I encourage everybody to, do this conversation, because it's important in many central ways. There are many things that one could say. And as I said, we will be bringing Michael over, which also means we physically will relocate him from the library closer to us, which hopefully makes those discussions more straightforward and easy to happen. So thanks again, Michael. I think this was a very stimulating and important talk, and it also demonstrates what we sort of did here, the comparisons between genes and units of information, sort of the true importance of a complexity thinking approach towards all of that. So thanks, everybody, and we see you all in 2 weeks for the next one in this series.
Thanks all.